"You're being selfish," my son said, standing up from the table with his napkin still in his hand. Then his wife picked up her wine glass and threw it straight at my face. The glass didn't just spill on me, it cut me open above the eye, and blood started running down into my collar while the whole table went silent. And here is the part nobody at that table understood. I smiled. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and drove myself to the emergency room, because what none of them knew was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for almost 3 months. My name is Arthur Kessler. I am 68 years old. I taught high school history in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for 31 years, and this is the story of the Easter dinner that ended one chapter of my life and started a much better one. I live in a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, the same house my wife Helen and I bought in 1989 when our son Brian was still in diapers. Helen passed away 4 years ago from breast cancer, and since then the house has felt bigger than it needs to be, quiet in a way that took me a long time to get used to. Brian is 34 now, married to a woman named Ashley for 5 years, and they have 2 kids, Lily, who is 6, and Sam, who is 4. The 2 upstairs bedrooms that used to belong to Brian and his sister growing up are still there, mostly empty except for when the grandkids stay over on weekends. And I never thought much about those rooms until the last few months, when I started noticing little comments here and there that made me pay closer attention. Ashley's parents, Gary and Linda Prescott, had lost their house outside Monroeville about 8 months earlier after a business investment went bad, and they had been living in an extended stay motel ever since, bouncing rent checks and complaining about it at every family gathering. I felt for them, genuinely, but I also felt something else growing underneath that sympathy, a quiet suspicion that kept getting louder every time Ashley looked around my living room like she was measuring it for furniture that wasn't hers. About 2 months before Easter, I sat down with my lawyer, a sharp younger man named Nathan Reyes, who had helped me update my will after Helen died, and I told him what I was noticing. Nathan didn't tell me I was being paranoid. He told me to keep my eyes open, get everything important documented and protected, and call him the second something crossed a line. We even joked about it a little, calling it Phase 1 just in case. I laughed when he said it. I did not know how soon I would need it. 2 weeks before Easter, Brian called me on a Tuesday evening while I was watching the news with a bowl of soup on my lap. He sounded a little too cheerful, the kind of cheerful he used to fake as a teenager right before asking me for money for a car repair that was really for something else. "Dad," he said, "we were thinking, since it's Easter and everybody's off work, maybe Gary and Linda could come too, so you can finally get to know them better as family." I told him that sounded fine, because it did sound fine, at least on the surface. I had met Gary and Linda a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always pleasant enough, and there was no reason for me to say no to a bigger holiday table. What I didn't know was that Brian had already discussed something else with Ashley the night before, something about how this Easter dinner would be the perfect time to bring up the empty bedrooms, how a family setting would make it harder for me to refuse. I found this out much later, but at the time I was just an old man happy his grandkids were coming over, spending the whole week before Easter cleaning the house, buying a ham bigger than I needed, and setting up the folding table in the dining room so everyone would fit comfortably. I even pulled out Helen's old china, the set she only used for holidays, because some habits from 30 years of marriage don't just disappear when the other person does. I wanted that Sunday to feel normal, warm, the way Easter used to feel when Helen was still alive, and the house was loud with kids running up and down the stairs. I had no idea that by the time dessert was supposed to come out, I would be bleeding on my own kitchen floor instead. Easter Sunday came in warm and bright, one of those early spring days in Pittsburgh where the sun actually cooperates for once. Brian, Ashley, and the kids arrived first around noon, and Gary and Linda pulled up about 20 minutes later in a rental car, since their own car had been repossessed a few months back, something Ashley mentioned a little too loudly while helping them carry a bag of dinner rolls inside. The kids ran straight to the backyard to find the eggs I had hidden that morning, and for a little while it actually felt like a normal holiday. Linda complimented Helen's china and asked polite questions about my years teaching history, and Gary talked about the Pirates game from the night before, and I remember thinking this wasn't so bad. Maybe I had been reading too much into things. Dinner started around 2 in the afternoon. Ham and mashed potatoes and green beans, the kids at their own small table by the window, the adults around the dining table with Helen's china laid out like it used to be. About halfway through the meal, Ashley set down her fork and looked around the dining room slowly, the same way she'd been looking at my living room for months. "This house is just so lovely, Arthur," she said. "All this space, and it's just you here most of the time, isn't it?" I said something simple back, agreed that it was a big house for one person, not thinking much of the comment. Brian glanced at Ashley across the table, a quick look that I caught but didn't understand yet, and Gary cleared his throat and started talking about the Steelers instead, which felt like a deliberate change of subject. I didn't know it then, but that was the calm before the part of the day I would never forget. Dessert hadn't even come out yet when Ashley set her wine glass down harder than necessary and said what she'd clearly been building up to all through dinner. Arthur, she said, my parents are really struggling right now, and you have 2 whole bedrooms sitting empty upstairs, and I just think it makes sense for them to move in here for a little while, just until they get back on their feet. The table went quiet except for the kids laughing about something in the other room. I set my own fork down slowly and told her I appreciated that Gary and Linda were going through a hard time, and I meant that. But my house was my home, not a solution to someone else's housing problem, and I wasn't comfortable turning my guest rooms into a permanent living arrangement for people I barely knew. Ashley's face changed immediately, the polite mask from earlier slipping off fast. It's not permanent, Arthur, she said, her voice sharper now. It's just until they save up enough, and those rooms just sit there collecting dust while my parents sleep in a motel off Route 22. Brian jumped in then, trying to sound reasonable but landing somewhere closer to pleading. Dad, come on, it's not that big of an ask. They're family too now. I looked at my son, at the man I raised, and I told him as calmly as I could that it was still my decision to make about my own home, and the answer right now was no. Gary and Linda sat there looking embarrassed, Linda's eyes down on her plate, Gary shifting in his chair like he wanted to disappear from the conversation entirely. I don't think they had asked for this fight to happen at my table, and looking back, I believe that. But Ashley wasn't finished, and neither was Brian, and the temperature in that dining room was about to rise a lot faster than I expected. Brian stood up from his chair so fast it scraped hard against the hardwood floor, and he pointed a finger at me the way I used to point a finger at him when he was 16 and came home past curfew. You're being selfish, he said, loud enough that I heard the kids go quiet in the next room. This whole house, just for you, and you can't help out family who actually need it. I told him to lower his voice, that there were children in the house, but he kept going, saying I had always been this way, always putting my own comfort first, always making things difficult. Ashley chimed in right behind him, her voice climbing right along with his. You have empty bedrooms, Arthur, she said, practically shouting it. Rooms just sitting there doing nothing while my parents suffer, and you won't even consider it for a second. I stayed seated. I stayed calm, because 31 years of teaching teenagers how to argue with their parents in essay form had taught me that raising my own voice back would only make things worse. I told them both, evenly, that this conversation was over, that my home was not open for negotiation at my own dinner table, and that if Gary and Linda needed help, we could talk about other options that didn't involve moving into my house. That was when Ashley picked up her wine glass, full dark red wine still swirling near the rim, and threw it across the table directly at me. The glass hit me above my right eyebrow and shattered, and I felt the sting a half-second before I saw the blood, warm and fast, running down the side of my face and onto Helen's good white tablecloth. The room went completely silent except for Lily's small voice from the other room asking what happened. For about 3 full seconds, nobody at that table moved. Ashley's hand was still hanging in the air where she'd released the glass, her mouth slightly open like she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. Brian stood frozen next to his chair, his face going pale as he looked at the blood running down my cheek and dripping onto the tablecloth in front of me. Gary and Linda both pushed back from the table, Linda's hand covering her mouth, Gary already reaching for a napkin to hand me even though nobody had asked him to. I touched the cut above my eyebrow, felt the warm wetness on my fingertips, looked at the blood on my hand, and then I did something that confused every single person in that room. I smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic one, just a small, calm smile. Because in that exact moment, sitting there bleeding at my own Easter table, I understood with total clarity that everything I had quietly prepared for over the last 2 months had just become necessary, and I no longer had to wonder if I was overreacting to anything. Dad, Brian said, his voice cracking, are you okay? I'm so sorry. She didn't mean, and I held up my hand to stop him without saying a word. I stood up from the table, walked to the hallway closet, and grabbed my jacket and my car keys off the hook by the door, pressing a folded dish towel against my forehead the whole time to slow the bleeding. Where are you going? Brian called after me, his voice somewhere between panic and confusion. I told him I was going to the hospital and that he should stay and take care of his family and his guests. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of anything out loud. I simply walked out my own front door, blood soaking into a kitchen towel, and got into my car in the driveway while my son stood in the doorway behind me, still holding his napkin, still not understanding what he had just started. The drive to Allegheny General Hospital took about 11 minutes, and I remember every single one of them clearly. I kept the towel pressed against my forehead with one hand and drove with the other, careful, steady, the kind of calm that surprised even me given the circumstances. At a red light on Butler Street, I reached into my jacket pocket with my free hand and pulled out my phone, and I typed out a short text message to Nathan Reyes, the lawyer who had been preparing for this moment right alongside me, without either of us knowing exactly when it would come. The message said only 4 words: Phase 1 is complete. I want to explain what that meant, because it wasn't some dramatic code from a movie, it was simple and practical. 2 months earlier, after noticing the pattern of comments about my house and my empty bedrooms, I had gone to Nathan and asked him what my options were if things ever escalated beyond just uncomfortable conversation. Nathan explained that emotional pressure and guilt tripping, as ugly as they are, don't hold up in any legal sense. But if something ever turned physical, even something as seemingly small as an object being thrown, that would be an entirely different matter, one with real legal weight behind it. We agreed that if that day ever came, my first step, before calling him, before calling anyone else, was to get to a hospital and get the injury documented properly by medical professionals. Because medical records created in the moment carry a kind of honesty that arguments and memories later on simply cannot match. Phase 1 was never about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't take back, there would be an honest record of exactly what happened, starting the moment it happened. I walked into the emergency room at Allegheny General with the dish towel still pressed against my forehead, blood having soaked through most of it by then, and a nurse at the front desk named Denise took one look at me and had me back in a treatment room within 10 minutes. Dr. Whitfield, a calm woman in her 40s with steady hands, examined the cut above my eyebrow and told me it was about an inch and a half long and would need 6 or 7 stitches to close properly. As she cleaned the wound, she asked me routine questions, how it happened, whether I felt safe at home, and I answered honestly, telling her that my daughter-in-law had thrown a wine glass at me during an argument at Easter dinner. Dr. Whitfield's expression didn't change much, but I could tell she had heard enough stories like mine to know exactly what came next. She explained, gently but clearly, that hospital policy required her to notify law enforcement whenever a patient came in with an injury caused by another person, especially in a case involving a possible domestic or family dispute, and that an officer would likely want to speak with me before I left. I told her that was fine, that I understood, and honestly, some small part of me had expected exactly that outcome. While she stitched the cut closed, working carefully and quickly, I sat there thinking about Helen, about how she would have handled this whole situation, and I decided she probably would have thrown the glass right back if she'd had the chance, which almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of getting stitches. About 20 minutes after Dr. Whitfield finished, a Pittsburgh police officer walked into my curtained-off area, notepad already in hand, ready to hear my side of what had happened at that dinner table. The officer's name was Daniels, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a patient, unhurried way of asking questions, the kind of patience that told me this was not his first time taking a report like this. He asked me to walk him through the entire evening, start to finish, and I did, keeping my voice level and my facts straight, not exaggerating anything, not leaving anything important out either. I told him about the request to move Gary and Linda into my house, about my refusal, about Brian and Ashley raising their voices, and about Ashley picking up her wine glass and throwing it directly at my face in front of everyone at that table, including her own parents and my 2 young grandchildren in the next room. Officer Daniels wrote everything down, occasionally asking a clarifying question, like exactly where I was sitting, how far away Ashley had been, whether the throw looked intentional or like an accident that happened while she was gesturing with her hands. I told him honestly that it looked deliberate to me, that she had picked the glass up, aimed, and thrown it, not swung her arm carelessly during an argument. He nodded, told me this would be filed as a report of simple assault, and that he would be following up with Ashley directly to get her account of events as well. While he finished writing, my phone kept buzzing in my jacket pocket, over and over, Brian's name lighting up the screen every single time. I didn't answer any of the calls, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say yet, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing while everything was still so fresh. Officer Daniels handed me his card before he left, told me to call if I remembered any additional details, and said someone would be in touch soon regarding next steps. That same evening, while I was still at home with 7 stitches and a bandage over my eyebrow, Officer Daniels and his partner drove out to Brian and Ashley's house to get Ashley's side of the story, since that's standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard about how that conversation went a few days later, partly from Brian and partly from Nathan, who had his own contacts check on the status of the report. According to what I was told, Ashley tried to explain the whole thing as an accident, insisting she had only been gesturing with her hands during an intense conversation, and the glass simply slipped out of her fingers by mistake. The problem for her was that this explanation didn't match what 4 other adults at that table had already told the responding officer earlier that evening, since Officer Daniels had also gotten brief statements from Gary, Linda, and even Brian before I left for the hospital. All 3 of them, even Brian, confirmed that Ashley had picked the glass up and thrown it, not dropped it or knocked it over by accident. Officer Daniels informed Ashley plainly that the injury, the eyewitness accounts, and the fact that the glass had traveled across the table, rather than simply falling near her, did not support an accidental explanation, and that the report would move forward as an assault charge, with the district attorney's office deciding how to proceed from there. I'm told Ashley cried during most of that conversation, alternating between insisting it was an accident and asking what would happen to her now that she had 2 young kids at home. Brian, from what he later told me himself, stood in the kitchen the entire time saying almost nothing, still trying to process how one heated argument about house guests had turned into police officers standing in his living room on Easter Sunday. Over the next several days, my phone rang constantly, mostly Brian, occasionally Ashley, the voicemail swinging wildly between apology and quiet anger, depending on who was calling and what time of day it was. I let most of them go to voicemail while I focused on healing and on meeting with Nathan Reyes to figure out what came next, because phase 1 had always just been the beginning, not the whole plan. Sitting in Nathan's office about a week after Easter, we talked through my options carefully. I told him I had no interest in dragging this out for years or trying to punish anyone beyond what the legal system decided was appropriate for what had actually happened. But I also told him I was done being treated like a housing solution or an inconvenience by people who were supposed to love me. Nathan suggested we move forward with 2 things at once. First, a temporary protective order, giving both Brian's household and me some legally enforced distance and cooling off time, while everything with the assault charge worked its way through the courts. Second, and more importantly to me personally, restructuring my estate so that my house and my savings would go directly into a trust for Lily and Sam's future education, administered by Nathan himself, rather than by Brian or Ashley, with me retaining full control and use of everything while I was alive. This wasn't about punishing my grandchildren or cutting Brian out of my life forever. It was about making absolutely certain that nobody could ever again treat my home, my safety, or my finances as something up for negotiation at a dinner table, using guilt and pressure instead of respect. Nathan filed the paperwork within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally back in control of my own life, instead of just reacting to whatever came next. About 2 weeks after Easter, against Nathan's advice, and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Brian and Ashley come by the house to talk in person. My stitches had come out by then, leaving a thin pink line above my eyebrow that the doctor said would fade over time, but probably never disappear completely. Ashley looked like she hadn't slept much, and Brian looked worse, the 2 of them sitting stiffly on my living room couch while I sat across from them in Helen's old reading chair. Ashley apologized first, her voice shaking, saying she never meant to hurt me, that she'd just been overwhelmed watching her parents struggle for months, and it all came out sideways at the worst possible moment. I told her I believed she regretted it now, but that regret didn't erase what happened, and that throwing something at another person, especially hard enough to draw blood, was never an acceptable way to handle disagreement, no matter how frustrated she felt. Brian tried to jump in, asking if there was any way I could talk to the district attorney's office and make the charge go away, and I told him plainly that this was no longer something I controlled, that the state was handling it now, and that Ashley would need to face whatever the legal process decided was fair, the same as anyone else would. I also told them both about the trust I had set up for Lily and Sam, explaining calmly that it wasn't a punishment. It was simply me making sure my home and my money were protected going forward, for my grandchildren's future, rather than sitting there as something to be negotiated over during family dinners. Brian went quiet for a long moment, looking at the floor, and I could see something shifting behind his eyes, somewhere between shame and finally understanding exactly what his family had lost sight of over the last several months. Ashley's court date came about 10 weeks later, and since it was her first offense with no prior record, the district attorney's office offered her a plea deal instead of taking the case to a full trial. She pleaded guilty to simple assault, and the judge sentenced her to 60 hours of community service, a modest fine, and 6 months of mandatory anger management counseling, along with the protective order Nathan had already helped put in place, staying active for the same period. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene like something out of a television show, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened, an outcome I honestly thought was fair given the circumstances. I didn't go to the hearing myself, choosing instead to spend that afternoon in my garden, since Nathan told me my written statement to the court had already said everything that needed saying. Word got around the neighborhood the way it always does in Squirrel Hill, and I was surprised by how many people reached out over the following weeks. My neighbor Carol from 2 houses down bringing over a casserole one evening just to check on me, an old teaching colleague calling to make sure I was doing all right after hearing a version of the story secondhand. Nobody made me feel foolish for what had happened, and nobody suggested I had overreacted by involving the police or the courts, which honestly meant more to me than I expected it to. Gary and Linda, through a local senior housing assistance program that Nathan actually helped connect them with, found a modest 1-bedroom apartment near Monroeville a few months later, something within their actual budget that didn't require anyone else's guest bedrooms to make work. It turned out there had been a reasonable solution to their housing problem all along, one that simply didn't involve guilt, wine glasses, or my house. By late summer, things between Brian and me had started, slowly and carefully, to find a new kind of normal. He reached out on his own, without Ashley, more than once, asking if we could get lunch, just the two of us, and during those lunches he apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything go away or minimize what had happened. He admitted he had let Ashley's frustration about her parents pull him into pressuring me in a way he wasn't proud of, and that watching me bleed at my own dinner table had been the moment everything about that pressure finally looked as ugly to him as it actually was. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and that I still loved him, but that trust between us would need to rebuild slowly, the same way any broken trust does, through consistent actions over time rather than through a single conversation. Ashley and I spoke exactly once, directly after the court proceedings concluded, a short, careful conversation where she thanked me, somewhat awkwardly, for not pushing the DA toward a harsher outcome than what she received. I told her honestly that I hoped the counseling helped her, and that I hoped someday we could sit at a table together again without either of us flinching, but that the choice about when that happened was no longer only up to me, and that some doors take longer to open than others, especially the ones that got slammed shut so hard. I started seeing Lily and Sam again on a regular schedule, usually with just Brian bringing them over on Saturday afternoons, and slowly the upstairs bedrooms filled back up with the sound of two kids playing board games and building blanket forts the way they always used to, exactly the way those rooms were always meant to be used in the first place. It's been almost a year now since that Easter Sunday, and my life looks different than it did back then, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The thin scar above my eyebrow is barely visible anymore unless you know exactly where to look for it, though I notice Brian's eyes drift to it sometimes when we're talking, like he's remembering something he'd rather forget. The trust Nathan set up for Lily and Sam is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or selfish, it was simply responsible, the kind of thing Helen would have wanted me to do for our grandkids, without a single ounce of guilt attached to it. I planted a bigger garden out back this spring, tomatoes and peppers mostly, the kind Helen used to grow every summer, and some Saturday afternoons Lily helps me water it, while Sam runs around chasing the neighbor's cat through the yard. Brian and I are rebuilding something real, slower than either of us would probably like, but real, brick by brick instead of pretending everything is fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that Easter Sunday, not really, not in the dramatic sense people usually mean when they use that word. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own choices to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them the most. And sometimes protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and legally is the only kind of revenge that actually lasts. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story from start to finish. And if it meant something to you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories, because I promise you, there are more coming.